Thank you. Thank you for the honor, Reverend Beth, of speaking with your congregation today. And I am honored and privileged to be with you today. It is not, in fact, often that an Orthodox priest has the opportunity to speak and fellowship with our brothers and sisters in the United Church Communion. So it is an honor to be here. Today we heard in the scripture reading specifically about the raising of Tabitha by Peter, and I want to return to that. But specifically what I want to talk about today, what I want to share with you today is really three gifts, specifically three gifts that I gave to my children last summer, which I think have import for today and what we're experiencing in general now. It is, I just want to say an apology to my daughter, because originally I had been joking with her that I was going to preach all about her. And I said, no, don't worry. But actually, she is obliquely mentioned. So, last summer, I had the opportunity, quite beyond my just belief that I could have it. But last summer I had the opportunity to go to Greece and attend an international symposium on climate change, specifically calling faith leaders, scientists, and politicians at the highest levels of society gathered together. Now, I had no idea any of this was kind of going on. I had just been invited. I had so much going on. I have spent my life, in fact, in the wilderness. I've built 12 altars in nature in all places in British Columbia and worshipped at them. And I've led people, youth and people out into the wilderness and worked and did seminars and workshops. I have studied and taught ecology. I love nature. And in fact, I really think that we cannot love God unless we also love his world. I think we can't say we love one unless we love the other. We have to totally and completely embrace the physicality of the creation through which God himself reveals love and justice and truth, which we were talking and singing about this morning, but more on that in just a moment. So I had attended this international symposium, and with these people, the United Nations director was there, and Al Gore's daughter was there, and all these people were there, and I was just there as this, dad from Vancouver, and I felt like Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, And I had no idea why I was there, and I'd been so busy getting there, I had no idea just how big it actually was, and there was only 150 of us. In fact, they closed down an entire Greek island just so that we could be on it. I've never had anything like that to me before. I live in East Vancouver, However, it was a really life-changing experience. And I'll tell you why in a second, and I'm going to fast forward until I got to when I got home. Because there I was sitting with my 3 children, and I sat with them in the backyard, and I said, I have to give you 3 things. 3 things. And it's these 3 things which I want to bring to you today and share with you today, as maybe they would be helpful for what is coming. And I explained to them in that backyard last year just what I had encountered at this symposium. Now, keep in mind, I have been working on climate change at the international level for years, but somehow the severity of the situation really came home to me in this symposium. And to put it in perspective, for instance, the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change was there. And he stood up and he made this presentation. There are New York Times journalists there and so on. And he made this presentation in front of them all. And he said, okay, had all these charts and things, and he's talking about the, temperature differentials and all kinds of horrors, honestly. And he finishes it by saying, he's a German, and he says, yeah, so This is the end of the world as we know it. And he sits down. And I'm like, okay, it's got to get better than this. And so then the director of the United Nations Forum from Climate Change stands up and tells 150 of us, she says, yes, Professor Schoenhuber is right. It's the end of the world as we know it. But we must have hope, she says. And I'm like, what? How does that look? How does that work, But the clarity which this symposium brought to me about what is actually happening in our climate, in our world, was harrowing. Now, I've spent the last practically year traveling the world, making this film on behalf of the Patriarch of Constantinople and others to try to bring faith communities to the table to discuss and even acknowledge climate change. And even among scientists and in conferences that I visit and people that meet, they're always saying, Father, where are the faith communities, Where are the faith communities? This is really the single greatest challenge that the earth has experienced since the last extinction event. This is it. This is what I call the bare knuckle round of an emerging climate crisis, the scope of which is only now coming into focus. We have 10 more years according to the United Nations and to the scientific communities, the international panel, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their report is clear. 10 years to completely, not partially, but completely decarbonize and prepare not for stopping climate change, but for dealing with the severity and the impacts of it. I'm not going to sugarcoat things. This is not the time in history to be nice. It's real. We are talking about catastrophic weather events, changing demographics, mass migrations, vast species extinction. Another intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystems and so on just came out with a report last week that said we are about to lose 1 million animal and plant species. Now, if you're an ecologist or a scientist or just a thinking human being that's connected to nature in some way, you realize that biodiversity, the complexity of life, the cornucopia of what God has created, is essential to life on earth and to human well-being. I often say, wherever I possibly can, and I've instructed my children, nay, indoctrinated my children to say the same thing, ecosystem health equals human health. More to the point, to realize that actually nature does not belong to us. It's not ours. It doesn't belong to us to exploit, to take, to resource, to anything. We must understand that there is a paradigmatic shift that we are being called to right now, and that nothing that we took for granted, our entire thinking, is relevant anymore in the face of everything that is happening. So I sat with my children and told them all this. It was a really cheering conversation. And I said, but I have 3 gifts. 3 gifts. Because after I was completely devastated by this symposium, and by the way, it has been an ongoing challenge for the last year making this film, because with my own eyes, I have seen lakes in Alaska bubbling with methane. I have seen the worst fire damage in California history with my own eyes. I have listened to the voices and the tears of indigenous peoples talking about food insecurity, dislocation, deculturalization. It's awful, and it's an abyss. And it's difficult to stare into the abyss of the truth of it, This morning we sang, we want justice, truth, and love. And yes, we do. But the consequences of having that are completely life-changing. I often say that saints, people talk about saints and what are saints like and what are they. Saints are human beings that have had to go through a lifetime of having their own preconceptions about God, about themselves, about their world, about other people, dismantled. And that is a traumatic and existential experience. But that is, again, what we're being called to, is truth in the midst of all of this. So right after the symposium, I had my backpack, my cassock, and it's like I went from high society, whatever, with my backpack, and I just went out to the wilderness in Greece. I've never been to the wilderness in Greece. I should have probably read something about the wilderness in Greece. And I went out into the wilderness, and I went hiking in the mountains of Meteora. Meteora is a place in central Greece where they have these huge columns of stone, vast cliffs, with monasteries 800 years old perched on top of them. And I went hiking up around them and sleeping out, under bushes and that sort of thing. And in fact, I remember one time I was trying to climb a cliffside. It was only about 80 or 90 feet, but I had hiked all the way up to this cliff, and it was really intense, and I'm climbing, I'm sweating, I'm dirty, cassock's getting caught. I nearly died, literally tripped and fell down and grabbed a branch about 5 feet away from another cliffside. And finally, I get to the top, and I'll never forget, I just climb up, and I get to the edge of where the monastery spot is on the top of the cliffside, and I lie down, and all of a sudden I hear people taking pictures all around me, and it's a tour bus of Russians who had come to this monastery through a highway that I didn't know existed anyways. But all through the Meteora area, I collected flowers, because my first gift to my kids was this: in the face of everything that's coming and that is right now. Climate change is not something that is going to happen, it's something happening now. I wanted them to know that they are surrounded by, cared for, and given examples by the whole cloud of witnesses. All of the indigenous elders through history. All of the saints that have walked this earth in humility, all those who have taught us how to live well upon the earth in the presence of the risen God. We have all that strength, all that guidance, from our church, from our history, and from our presence. We have all of that to take with strength within us. All of our ancestors, all of the people we know, all of the people who have ever been, all of the animals, all of creation, in fact. My best friend, who was my deacon for 10 years, he used to say to me every week when we would go to church together to serve the liturgy together, he would say, Kaleeg, he'd say, remember, every good thing you do is cheered on by all the angels of heaven, the saints of God, and all creation itself. So all those flowers. The second thing, the second gift, was a little stone that I picked up on the peak of Mount Olympus, because I hiked up to the peak of Mount Olympus. I went from Meteora to Mount Olympus. I had no idea. I thought Mount Olympus was just like every other mountain in Canada. But I had no idea how intense it was. I was wearing my sandals. I wasn't ready. I saw some Germans coming down from the peak. They had helmets and climbing gear. They looked at me like I was crazy. But I got there to the very peak, and I got there at dawn. I hiked through the middle of the night. I had a 1,000-foot cliff this side, 3 feet away from me, and a slope going down this way. It was biting winds. I was sweated. I couldn't breathe properly. I fainted twice. But I got to the peak just as the sun rose from the Aegean, and the words came to mind from Gerard Manley Hopkins's poem. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. And then at the end it says, and though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning, from the brown brink eastward springs with warm breast and with bright wings. In this sense, God is present. God is in the very fabric of creation. The way Dylan Thomas put it is we could even say that God is the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. God is at the heart of life, and that nothing we do to it, however we mishew it, however we trod upon it, however anything happens, nothing will stamp out the fire of the presence of God in the midst of the world. And not only that, but it's beautiful. That God is beauty moving and shining through the earth. And that beauty is imperishable. It is impossible to put out, to stop. It just surges through the world. And it annoys me when I get to my garden, but it's fantastic when you think about the presence of God in our midst. And I gave them each a stone to say, remember, no matter what comes through those doors, no matter what happens, God is beautiful, God is present, and God is victorious and living and all-powerful in his creation. And then finally, I took a journey. I was invited by a theologian of Oxford, Elizabeth Theocritou, to go and to visit this monastery, and I went to this monastery, and women's monastery in the heart of the Greek mountains, and I climbed all the way up there and made it. And the nuns received me warmly, and then they brought the abbess, the Gerondasa in the Greek, out to meet me. And just watching her come towards me was extraordinary, because it was like watching a mountain of a person move towards me, a mountain of spiritual strength and guidance. She had been arrested twice, for having shared seeds and started a seed exchange. She was an extraordinary human being. And she sat down and she said, "You have 3 children," she said, "and I have a gift for each of them." And it was a tiny little silk cross from the silk that they had actually made themselves, or prepared themselves and harvested themselves. And she had handmade it with her own hands. And I took it, and she said, "This is the way forward." And I gave it to my kids, and I said, and the third gift I have, the third in the face of it all, is that there is no way forward but the way of the cross, the way of love, the way of truth, the way of co-suffering, not just with the human beings around the world that are already suffering in the changing climate and the changing world, but with the animals and the plants and the whole fabric of this living planet that we are blessed to be on. And in the midst of all that, we ourselves may play different roles in the way of the cross. We heard this morning that wonderful verse, "Oh, how I wish to gather you all as a hen gathers her chicks," which is an extraordinary verse because the Lord Christ is actually also saying something that every farmer would have known. And that is that a hen's practice, if a barn is burning down, is to gather the chicks under her wings and to protect them. And many times, hens have been found in a burned barn, burned to death, but their chicks will come out from underneath their wings, safe. Some of us may have that role, to gather and protect people and to take the burning of this world now so that others may be saved. And still others may stand in front of this world and may call out miracles like Peter in the power of the resurrection to call out life. Who knows what your way in particular is, but there is one fact. Each of us right now, no matter our age, no matter our position, no matter who we are called by God, by this earth, by everything just and beautiful, like no other human being or generation has ever been called before. It's now. We are called now to do extraordinary things, extravagances for God, proclamations, whatever we need to do. Now is the moment. And I would even say this: listen. Christians are always talking, you know. I don't know what it is about Christianity that we think we need to talk so much. When I was in Greece many years ago, I visited a monastery at which there was the skull of St. John Chrysostom, the greatest preacher in Christendom. Extraordinarily, his right ear was still intact, pink as the day he used it. Somehow the greatest preacher was a greater listener. We need to listen to the earth, to each other, to our suffering, and especially and through it all, to our God. Because this is the only time in history, and I cannot stress this enough, that we're going to do it. Those of us in this room, are all of us going to be those who stand against this? Or not stand against it, but move with it maybe. Not so much heal the earth, but become healed by it. We are the ones who are called into this challenge, and it is now, not later, now. This is the moment for us to have a conversation with our spouses, with our children, to have a come to Jesus moment with our churches. This is it. But we have everything before us to go forward with. We can go forward with all the cheer of creation and the cloud of witnesses, knowing that God is present and beautiful upon this earth, knowing that the resurrection is part of that beauty and we ourselves are beautiful as well. And finally, we know how to proceed. The way of the cross, the way of love, the way of co-suffering, the way of the other, giving ourselves that the earth might live. Amen.